Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Daniel, Tolga, and all the rest of the committee, individuals and institutes that make this organization possible. It's a pleasure to be here today this afternoon. So this will be sort of a shift from individual and maybe inter-individual memory to more institutional parts of the story. And I will basically try to introduce three major councils that were functioning under the office of the Sheikh al-Islam during this time period between 1918 and 1923. So one main distinguishing feature of the modern state is the development of a modern bureaucratic apparatus. Even though bureaucratic structures predate the 19th century, the legal rational authority emerged as the main legitimately perceived form of social and political organization at the turn of the century. Modern states and societies have organized themselves mostly through rational bureaucratic structures, which, as Max Weber underlined, are distinct from past bureaucracies. The separation of the office and office holder, skill-based appointments, clearly defined tasks, salary-based payments, written rules and documentation, and standardized impersonal rulings are some main features of modern bureaucracy. The Ottoman Imperial state, since the early 19th century, took part in a set of legal, social, economic, and political reforms, which were linked with one another in promoting a new social political order. The rise of a modern bureaucracy, with one specific subset dedicated to religion, was an intended consequence of these reform acts. Religion turned out to be one main social institution whose functions, capacities, as well as engagement with other institutions were significantly re-examined and subjected to a set of new regulations. As such, in the middle of the age of the modern reforms, religion stood at the center of transformations that the state and society experienced as well as implemented. It is beyond the scope of this presentation to address the rise of the category of religion itself, as well as that of a secular citizenship, that is, the notion of equality before the law, regardless of religion. However, it is worth underlining and drawing our attention to the concurrent developments of the categories of religion and secular under modern bureaucracy, and the indexing of Islam as one main religion, whose regulation the modern imperial state saw intrinsic to its rule. As the Ottoman Empire turned more Islamic in its nature, as in the case of the addition of the constitutional article expressing that the religion of the state is Islam in 1876, it also turned its panoptical eyes more towards religious practices, organizations, as well as materials, clearly setting the boundaries between the state-approved and state-rejected Islam. The development and expansion of modern bureaucratic structures included those dedicated to the religious field as well. Hence, the office of the Sheikh al-Islam, which is called Bab-ı Meşihat, was opened in 1827, literally in place of the old Janissary Corps offices. The Meşihat was the highest religious administrative organization in the bureaucratic hierarchy. Several administrative branches served under it to govern the religion of Islam. The 19th and 20th centuries, even the World War I and its aftermath, witnessed the flourishing of Ottoman bureaucratic offices and institutes funded to regulate, to control, and to subjugate Islam and public morality to the drives of the modern statehood, which will be the main argument of my presentation here, and which I will try to illustrate through going over the functioning of the councils. So in this presentation, I will focus on three Meşihat councils governing Islam and public morality during and after the World War I. I will provide some basic information about their functioning, about their funding, and the ways in which they operated and the issues in which they were enrolled in. The first council to be mentioned in chronological order is Meclis-i Meşayih, which literally is the council on the Sufi orders and Sufi brotherhood, tariqas. It was founded in 1866, though the records date back to 1879, so there's a gap between the funding of the institute and then its functioning. And it might be either because record keeping might have started later, or it might have to do with the page that it was opened, but it didn't start to function until 1879. Even though the Ottoman Empire had regulations about Sufi brotherhoods before the establishment of this specific council, the jurisdiction of the Meşayih Council pertained to each Sufi brotherhood, and its activities increased particularly after 1900s, as evident in the archival record books. So this council has, among the other two, compared to the other two, has the highest number of archival record books, but most of them date after 1900s. The Meşayih Council drafted decrees about the sheikh appointments and set rules about the succession in the brotherhood. The Council detailed out the succession rules through each one of its bylaws, Nizamnames, the last one of which is strikingly 1918. The Council addressed complaints it received about certain Sufi lodges, tekkes and zaviyes, and asked the concerned sheikh to appear before itself for an explanation. It also engaged with the physical and material conditions of the tekkes and zaviyes, that is the Sufi lodges, and their occupants. As Istanbul witnessed a major human influx in 1910s and 1920s, the Sufi lodges were sometimes occupied by the family members of the ex-Sufi sheikhs, fire survivors, the ones that broke out in Istanbul, as well as more prominently soldiers. The council, the Meshayikh Council, corresponded with other state ministries, as well as the brotherhoods themselves, to ensure that only those certified to stay at the lodges would reside in them. It also underscored that it was under its jurisdiction to regulate who could stay in buildings pertaining to Sufi orders. Throughout the war and the occupation of Istanbul, the council also corresponded with other Ottoman administrative bodies to ensure that the Sufi lodges received food and heating material to donate to their members as well as to the poor in the neighborhood. Even though material sources and physical conditions of Sufi lodges and the human capital of brotherhoods seem to have deteriorated during and after the World War I, the occupation of Istanbul does not seem to have a direct impact on the functioning of Sufi brotherhoods in the city. It might be asserted, I claim, that the Allied forces in Istanbul considered the operations of Sufi orders more as an internal domestic matter that they did not want to directly suppress. As for the Ottoman authorities, they continued their control and regulations on Sufi brotherhoods, and part of what they condemned was related to contemporary circumstances. In archival registries of the council, there are entries about the performance of dancing and drinking at certain lodges that the Meshayikh Council labeled as improper and sought investigation about. Even though similar disapprovals might be found in previous records of the council, these entries about drinking, entertainment, engagement with women are similar to criticisms voiced by other Ottoman religious bureaucratic units, which I will cover later in my presentation. And I assert these claims might have emerged in the past too, but they also need to be contextualized better in this particular time framework. The second Meşihat Council that needs to be underlined is Tetkiki Mesaif ve Müellifat Şer'iye Meclisi, which I will translate as the Council on the Inspection of Printed Qurans and Islamic Religious Publications. So just to cut the name short, I will previously refer to it as the Islamic Print Council throughout the talk. The Council on Sufi Sheikh was created in 1866, so this one is created slightly later, like 30 years after that one. And I think one can explain the time gap between the two councils through the historical precedence of Sufi orders over Islamic print, as well as the very low literacy rates, meaning like the impact of print was still behind the impact of Sufi brotherhoods themselves. So the state was more eager to regulate Sufi brotherhoods earlier or before than it was eager to control Islamic publications. So there are two councils created in 1889. One is Teftiş Mesahif, that one was originally devoted just to examine printed Qurans. And Mesahif is the plural of Musaf, which is basically the book of the Quran. So 1889, there is a specific one created under the Meşihat just to inspect the accuracy of any printed Quranic book. And then in 1889, there's another council, Tetkik Müellifat, which was initially serving under the Minister of Education, but then it was attached to the Meşihat, to the Office of the Sheikh al-Islam, to inspect any printed Islamic books. And it seems like circa 1910, the two councils were united under this name, Tetkiki Mesaif and Müellifat Şer'iye Meclisi, to inspect and approve any printed Quran and other Islamic books. The jurisdiction of the council was broadened over time to include not just books, but also periodical publications, and to sanction Islamic content present in any printed publication, meaning even if the printed material was just an ordinary paper, as long as it was citing any Quranic hadith any Quranic verse or any hadith meaning prophetic sayings, then it has to have the approval of the council before publication. The Islamic Print Council examined the accuracy of the Quranic orthography in the printed material, but it also sought to preserve ritualistic purity and enforced rules to guarantee the observance of respect due on Islamic printed text. Henceforth, in the long story of the print of the Quran in the Ottoman Empire, from its official beginning in 1873 until the end of the empire, including the years of the occupation, the imperial regime developed different strategies and measures to ensure that the Quran as a printed text received a due reverence and was exempted from being reduced to a mere ordinary material object. The war and post-war years tested these limits as the material shortages affected the religious domain as well. The Minister of the Interior and the Meshihat Councils received multiple number of complaints from the public about the circulation of Quranic texts on ordinary paper, Quranic pages being used as wrapping paper in grocery stores, butchers, even restrooms. While in most of the cases, the investigations proved that the users had no intention of disrespect, but were just not aware that the paper they used contained Quranic passages, the incidents themselves reflect the paper shortage of the period. Under these circumstances, the Islamic Print Council ordered publishers, particularly the owners of periodicals and newspapers, not to publish the Quranic verses in their entirety, but just to print a couple of words from the beginning and end, or just cite the verse number, or better, just to print them in Turkish instead of the original Arabic throughout the war and post-war years. While the question of whether the Quran can be translated into Turkish or not occupied the religio-political discussions of the early Turkish Republican period too, the strategies to protect the materiality of the Quran as a printed text augmented through the World War I years. It seems that the occupation of Istanbul did not alter this tendency at all. On the contrary, the Allied forces might have supported the Ottoman authorities for this end, that is, to support measures against offenses on religious sentiments of the public. It is evident that religious matters were not only considered insignificant in the middle of the major social-political transformations, but also religion, and particularly Islam, were designated by the Ottoman government, as well as the occupying forces, the Allied commissioners, as a domestic internal matter to be left to the governance of the Ottoman state itself. The legal precept about the protection of religion, and particularly the rejection of offense on religious sentiments, siyat-ı diniye, seems to have emerged around this period, and the Ottoman authorities seem to have taken good advantage of such socio-legal enactments to open a venue for themselves in their negotiations with the Allied forces in the city. The last council that I would like to draw to your attention is Darul Hikmet Islamiye, which literally means the Abode of Islamic Wisdom. The council is generally presented in the secondary sources as a high Islamic council dedicated to abstract theological discussions, but my observation and my study on the record books of the council prove that it was actually a post-World War I institute created by the state to govern matters that emerged in Istanbul, particularly after the war. So it dealt with issues the issues that covered have a wide range, ranging from anything from Christianization of Muslim orphan kids to gender mixed entertainment venues in the occupied city. Similar to the functioning of the other councils, they both themselves received complaints from the public, so they received petitions from the public, or the Minister of Interior received complaints from the public and they just direct these issues to this council, or they sometimes themselves were just involved in governing the major social change ongoing in Istanbul. And some of the issues that the council addressed are similar to topics that we heard in presentations yesterday about jazz, music, entertainment, cinema, and some of the ones that we will be hearing more tomorrow about drinking, alcohol drinking, then dry Istanbul, dry Turkey, whatever. And then so you might see the similarities, but just to give some examples, the Council Darul Hikmet Islamiye debated the appropriateness of drinking, especially in close proximity of mosques, the music and cinema shows in which men and women came together in Istanbul, the screening of pornographic movies, especially again in certain regions of the city, the influx of refugees and soldiers and their improper acts in public, the flirting between men and women in public areas, or Muslim women swimming and their revealed clothing. So all these distinct examples about drinking, entertainment, women's clothing, and sexual conduct were being elaborated not just in discussions in the Darul Hikmet Islamiye Council by the Council, but also in the public domains, especially through periodical publications. What needs to be underlined and observed here, in my opinion, is the expansion of the notion of public morality. Even though among intellectuals, debates on public morality even actually what constitutes morality itself, this whole discussion about the separation between religion and morality, and what constitutes vicdan, what constitutes consciousness, whether we can talk about individual, how individual is to sacrifice for the better, for the sake of the society, and all those discussions, 19th century, early 20th century discussions. So there is all these intellectual discussions going on. But I think the war and post-World War I years granted public morality a much more practical dimension than ever before, and the claims for sovereignty over public morality were appropriated by contemporary imperial regimes, including the Ottoman Empire itself, and emerging nation states, including the Turkish state, in fostering new states and societies. And I think that's also important to contextualize in this regard the acts and enactments and legal decrees drawn by both the Ottomans themselves as well as allied powers, and discussions going on in France, in Britain, very similar discussions about drinking, entertainment, women's clothing, and all that, those issues. So just as religion emerged to be a legal category to be respected and protected, so was public morality. The offense on religious sentiments, as well as infringements on public morality, were considered inept, socially and legally improper, and if necessary, deserving punishment by both the Ottoman bureaucratic bodies as well as the allied powers occupying the imperial capital. So let me conclude by recapitulating and highlighting some main points of my presentation. The one thing to first maybe underline is that the World War I and post-war conditions were not only difficult for Istanbul's subject citizens, but also for the bureaucratic administrators and state authorities. So they had their own shortages as well, which included very basic items from pen, paper, just the basic materials, to more abstract issues and public matters. But the Ottoman religious bureaucratic administrators tried to affirm or create at least some control vis-à-vis the allied powers over the religious and moral content of the press and public acts in the occupied city. It's important first to underline that the Ottoman bureaucracy was still in force during the armistice years. In the aftermath of the Great War, the Ottoman imperial state structures did not immediately collapse. The imperial state continued, or at least tried to sustain, its legal rational bodies, and as such created even new ones, as seen in the case of Darül Hükümet İslamiye, which is created right in 1918. In the case of Tetkik Mesaif and Müellefat-ı Şer'iye Meclisi, the Islamic Print Council, some bureaucratic units of the empire were adopted by the emerging Turkish Republic. I'm sorry, I didn't have the digital image, so I wasn't able to bring that one. But when you look at the archive records of this council, in one of them, in the middle of the book itself, let's say, I don't know, in page 80, so at the beginning you see that the records are being kept in Ottoman Turkish, in Arabic script, but then from then on, you just see that it's being written in Turkish, this time through Latin script. But the record keeping itself has the same idea. They record the number of published, the number of printed Quranic books, who published these, how many numbers. So the alphabet changes, but the record keeping goes on in the same way. Not just institutional settings and institutional continuities, but also legal categories of the empire seem to be inherited by the new emerging Turkish state. The early republic had similar gendered and purified conceptions of public morality, which, for instance, outlawed excessively leisurely spending and drinking. That was one of the first laws passed by in the Turkish assembly itself. While the occupation of Istanbul limited the political, military, and administrative capacities of the Ottoman state and created a new cityscape for its inhabitants, the Ottoman bureaucratic bodies, as well as the broader Muslim public, seem to utilize the emerging international legal rational instruments for their own ends. To put it differently, the enforcement of a dual censorship mechanism between the Ottoman administration and the high allied commissioners did not work only one way around, that is, through the Ottomans obeying the allied powers' decisions, but rather it encompassed a new set of negotiations and bargaining formulated by each side. This is most evident, at least in my own research, in the common accepted vision that Islam as a public religion and morality as fulfillment and observance of distant public acts and commitments emerged as two main categories, as two main artifacts. They were defined and acknowledged by the Ottoman government, the emerging Turkish nation state, and the occupying allied forces as internal matters to be mostly left to the rule of the local authorities. As such, the political and military occupation and negotiations seem to have promoted a domesticated Islam and public morality. Islam and public morality were labeled as domestic matters that the occupiers could leave to the occupied, at least to some extent. Last but not least, I will just cut this short to have more time for question and answer session, but there was also conflict and disagreement between the Meshiat councils, which I will not go over in detail right now. If you are interested, we can just cover that in the Q&A session. But it is important to see how the bureaucracy was functioning, was enforced, but it's also bureaucratic units themselves had their own disagreements, conflicts, bargaining, negotiation. So it's not only between the Ottoman powers, between the Ottoman authorities and the Allied powers, but also the inner discussions among Ottomans themselves, and also, of course, between the Istanbul and Ankara government. In short, in the middle of the transition, transformation, and chaos, certain legal categories expanded and received wider socio-political support. In this presentation, I asserted that the rejection of any offense on religion and religious sentiments and infringements upon public morality were one such main pair that the Ottoman Imperial government, the emerging Turkish nation state, and the Allied powers occupying Istanbul agreed upon. Thank you.